Last class, tell everyone about when the button controls the player's movement. We talked about vector normalization. Some students are not very clear this lesson, so we're going to show you the math. Vector normalization. The purpose is to help you lay a solid foundation. Go deep. Only so. In the future, everyone will know when they encounter problems. I know why. To figure out vector normalization, first you must know what a vector is. And then you take the modulus of the vector. And finally, you can understand what vector normalization is. Why do vector normalization? First, let's see what the first problem vector is. In mathematics, vector is also known as Euclidean vector, geometric vector, a quantity having magnitude and direction. It can be visualized as a line segment with arrows. The direction of the vector indicated by the arrow. The length of the line represents the size of the vector. The quantity corresponding to a vector is called a quantity. Scalar in physics. Quantity or scalar size only. No direction. For example, the orange arrows in the picture represent vectors. The green line represents the scalar. We are going to use vectors in the game. You must know how to represent vectors. There are 4 ways to represent vectors: algebraic representation, geometric representation, coordinate representation, matrix representation. Algebraic representation usually indicated by an arrow above the letter. Geometric representations are usually represented by directed line segments. Coordinate representation. Usually the starting point of the vector is the coordinate original. Then represent the vector with the coordinates of its endpoint. Matrix representation belongs to the content of linear algebra. Due to the fact that most students have not learned linear algebra, we won't emphasize too much here. Understand the representation of vectors. The purpose is to perform operations on vectors. There are many kinds of vector operations. Due to the need for subsequent vector normalization calculations, let's first introduce to you how to find the modulus of a vector. The modulus of vector A is equal to the sum of squares of the components of vector then A, extraction of square root. For example, with coordinates, n of m represents the vector A. then the modulus of vector A equals the square of m plus the square of n under the root sign. The modulus length of a vector is actually the size of the vector. Geometrically, that's the length of the arrowed line representing the vector. Through this schematic, you can also feel it intuitively. A vector of modulus 1. We call this the unit vector. A vector modulo 0 is called a zero vector. A normalized memory. Up angle brackets. Normalized vector, also known as the unit vector of vector A. Calculation formula. Here it is. Through this formula, you will also find that because the modulus of the zero vector is 0, so zero vector normalization requires special handling. The meaning of normalization is scale vector A to a unit vector. After normalization, during the calculation, we don't need to think about it. The impact of specific mode length. Only consider the direction of the vector. For example, in games, the direction of the player's motion is represented by the vector A. Position coordinates when the joystick handle is dragged. 453. So vector is equal to 354. If the player's movement speed is 10, at this moment, multiply the velocity by vector A to get 40 to 30. According to the die length formula. Then, per unit time, the player's range of motion becomes 50. If we normalize the vector A, then the normalized vector A becomes 3/5. Then multiply the velocity 10 by the normalized vector. Get value. According to the die length formula. Then in unit time, the player's distance is still 10. What about this time? Vectors only affect the direction of the player's movement. Does not affect the player's movement speed. So far, you get the idea. Why control player movement by pressing buttons? And the joystick controls the player's movement. It's time for vector normalization. Actually, in all scenarios where the vector only needs to control the direction, we all need to do vector normalization. Let's briefly summarize the main content of this lesson. In this lesson, we introduced the concept of vectors, A vector is a quantity that has magnitude and direction. Next, I learned about the four representations of vectors. Algebraic representation, geometric representation, coordinate matrix representation. Finally, we learned about the computation of vectors. Emmanuel introduces the things that need to be used in the game. Modulus of vector and vector normalization processing. The key point needs to be understood: vector normalization and its application scenarios. After class, I hope the students will share the content of our class, combined with the previous buttons to control player movement. Think again, when the follow-up joystick controls the player's movement. What role does vector normalization play in this?